Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Kalia Vandever, an American trombonist and composer based in Brooklyn, New York. Kalia has a new album coming out on AKP Recordings, We Fell in Turn. It's her first solo record following 2 albums with a full band, In Bloom and Regrowth. But We Fell in Turn centers on Kalia's trombone. There's very sparse furnishing from electronics, voice and loops too, but really what you're hearing is this instrument and Kalia as a player just unfurling patiently into space, responding to her own reflections and reverbs, following these prompts as well from producer Lee Medvin, who gave these improvisatory instigators for Kalia to work with when they recorded the album over 3 days in upstate New York. It's a lovely record. I've been having wonderful time with it. It's a great headphone listen to occupy that space and hear the trombone navigating that emptiness. It's beautiful. I loved Kalia's records as well. 3 great ones. I'm still having a good time with these as well. And it was really great to get Kalia's thoughts on them. We had a good time. So I'll include links in the show notes to the new record. And if you want to support Crucial Listening, you can do over at Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/crucial listening. You can chip in any amount you like, monthly or just as a one-off, which will help keep the podcast going. Thank you so much. And thanks for your support generally and for listening and sharing your thoughts on the show. Really appreciate it. Okay. Hope you enjoy this episode. This is Kalia Vandever on Crucial Listening. Hello, Kalia. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hi, Jack. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you on. So you're here to talk about your 3 important albums. Before we get to those, I want to talk about your debut solo album, We Fell in Turn. So you've done 2 records prior to this one, both with the band. This is the first one you've done solo. Is there a reason that now is the time that you're now doing a solo album? Is there a particular, I don't know, things converged in a way that makes it feel like this is the right point to be doing that?
Not necessarily. I wasn't planning on releasing a solo album this soon.
Right.
I started the project right before the pandemic. I think I played my first solo show in late 2018. And I played a series of solo shows before the pandemic, and then found myself playing mostly solo shows during the pandemic for obvious reasons, and was developing the set more for live stream performances or outdoor shows. And I played one solo performance streamed through this platform called ODA, O-D-A, and Scott Osgood at AKP heard that performance and reached out to me asking if I had plans to record a solo album.
Oh, wow.
And
right.
Yeah, and at the time I didn't have plans for it because my head was mainly focused on my quartet and planning for the next quartet release, because at that time when he reached out, I believe my quartet was about to go into the studio to record my sophomore album, Regrowth, and that was in September 2021, I believe, is when we recorded that record. And so it was right around that time that we were going into the studio when Scott reached out to me expressing his interest for a solo record. And I remember we got on a call and I told him that it's something that I recently had passion for, but couldn't really conceive of recording it because so much of the solo work is improvised, and so much of the performance element is improvised, and like there are songs that come from those improvisations, which was definitely the case for the record. But I don't know, I had never recorded a fully or mostly improvised album before, especially not under my name. Going into the first two releases, everything was composed, and while there are a lot of improvisational elements, there's nothing that's like fully improvised on those two records. And so it was hard for me to imagine entering, a studio or a similar space to a studio. We ended up recording in a house, which I think helped me a lot. But it was just hard for me to imagine that process, both in that it's solo and that so much of it is improvised.
Right. Yeah.
So a long-winded way of saying I didn't imagine I would record a solo album when I did, nor did I imagine it would come out a year after my Regrowth album. I didn't think that I would be releasing this soon after.
Right.
But it's exciting and makes me nervous at the same time.
So what were the actual sessions like? So you did it over 3 days, right, in upstate New York. How did those sessions pan out?
It was really nice. So Lee Mebin, who's the producer of the record, he's a really good friend of mine, and he's worked on the last two records. And it's something that we had talked about doing, but only in a casual way. And so when I told him that I had the intention of recording a solo record, he was really excited. And so he brought up the idea of going upstate and recording it in his family home, which he's recorded a lot of his records there. And he'll normally go up for a week and work on the music for that long. And so he said we could stay for as long as a week, or, he knows the way that I work in a recorded setting, and I don't like to elongate the time too much. Like the last two albums we recorded in a day.
Wow. Funny.
Yeah. So he knows how I am, because there's just so much pressure for me when I am in a recorded setting. But I think with this record, we knew that we wanted the performance element to feel a part of the record. And we also knew that we wanted to try a lot of things. And so we went up over a long weekend, and the first day was mainly just like setting up and getting sounds. And I think we recorded a few things the first day, but we really dug in the second day and recorded a lot of material, and then used the third day to listen to everything. And there were a few ideas that we recorded that we thought we could execute better. So if, there was like, if we were messing with different effects, or if I was thinking about a certain concept, but there was an element missing, he would suggest like, let's just try that again, and like maybe think of it more in this way. Cause he came up with a lot of the concepts, the improvisational concepts, when we were recording, which was really nice. And so the third day we kind of used to see what we had and see how we could improve upon some of the concepts.
Yeah. I read about these concepts of dictated prompts that Lee gave, and as someone who doesn't deal in improvisation as a musician at all, I'm so fascinated as to what that is, like what kind of thing that would be. So what kind of prompts what kind of concepts was Lee putting to you to kind of instigate the improvisation?
There was one prompt that he dictated before going into an improvisation that was think of an early childhood memory. And it was as simple as that. And I overthink things. So the first take, I start an idea and then immediately stop. And I'm like, ugh, like I'm two in my head about this. And he's like, that's not the idea. He's like, I'm going to say something and you're going to just start playing. Like, don't, like, you can take a moment, take a breath, but really try not to, read into it too much.
Right.
So once I felt a little more settled in that memory, that unlocked a lot of other ideas for me. And so it was kind of nice. I feel like the general flow of the prompts was he would say something, I would live in that space for a little while, and then we would stop. And there were a few times where I told him that I wanted to keep recording or like try something else because it brought up another idea or another memory for me. And so I feel like that ended up being a lot of what came up for me in terms of inspiration behind a lot of these pieces, just like trying to imagine, the earliest memories of pain and joy and excitement and where I am now and how it's evolved over time. And there was another prompt that was, think of a food from your childhood.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. And again, I was like, well, like, should the music sound like the food? Am I trying to like embody the and he stopped me again. He was like, no, just like think of, when you think of childhood or you think of, nostalgic foods, like what comes to mind? So I thought of this this butter mochi cake that my grandma used to make and now my mom makes. But it's very like reminiscent of home. And so that's what ended up coming up. And it was nice because when I was working with the graphic designer on the album cover, she asked me about, some of the concepts we were working with. And I told her about the mochi cake, and she ended up using that a lot when she was working on the album cover. So cool. Yeah. So it all ties in.
One other thing I wanted to bring up, which I think is adjacent to that, is that it is mentioned as well in the text that childhood memories and your Hawaiian heritage are prominent in this record. I mean, was that purely through working with the prompts? Had you kind of figured that energy was going to be in the record, or that influence was going to be in the record prior to going into it, or did that just emerge throughout the process of recording it?
It certainly came up when I was recording the album. I've been thinking about, ancestry and my grandfather and the ways that he comes up in my life since his passing in 2019. And he is really present when I play music. That's when I feel him the most. And so I found that when I was recording the solo works, a lot of the pieces live in one space for a little while. So I feel like the melodies or the trajectory of a piece comes from like what emerges for me in that moment. And when I was thinking about childhood and like my maternal grandparents who are Filipino and Hawaiian culturally, they came up a lot when I was thinking of my childhood because they were always very present in our lives growing up. And my grandfather was very soft-spoken, but he was always really supportive and really connected to the music that I made. And so I feel like this was another way of like me kind of carrying on his legacy.
Awesome. The record is wicked. I've had such a good time with this.
Thanks.
So people, please go check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes. So let's go do your important records now. Before we get to the records specifically, a question I like to ask here is about how you thought about the word important when picking your 3 records. So was there a way that you understood important in order to come up with the 3 records that you did?
So I was thinking of important albums in the way that they inspired We Fell in Turn. And I was thinking about both how it influenced that record, but how they influenced both my musical upbringing, but also where I am musically today. And while 2 of them have been important in the last year or so, one of them has been important to me since high school. So it was nice to consider how certain records that have changed me recently have similarities to the ones that kind of formed my earliest thoughts on music and improvisation early on, like when I was in high school.
Cool. Which one do you want to go for first?
I guess I'll start with the Grouper album.
Yeah.
That one's called Dragging a Dead Deer Up a Hill. Yeah, that's the one that I discovered when I was in high school.
Could you give me a bit of insight, like an overview of why this one is important to you?
Sure. When I was thinking of why this record is important to me, a memory that came up was when I started going for walks and listening to music when I'm upset or sad, which is something I do regularly now. And it's something that soothes me. It's something that helps me work through whatever I'm going through. And this record is kind of like one of the earliest records I can think of where I started doing that, and I was like 16 or 17 years old and, going through what I thought was the hardest period of my life. Like super angsty teen, just like, oh, I'm heartbroken and, I don't know how to like move through these emotions, and I'm just going to like walk around. I lived in downtown LA at the time.
Right.
And I had a lot of independence at the time, and I lived with my dad, and he would come home pretty late from work. So I would get home from school and often just like have a lot of time to myself. And those were the years that I like really dug into music and formulated like my music taste at the time. And a friend of mine shared a grouper with me, and I had never heard anything like it. And first, it was my introduction to music that was really patient. And I feel like I think about patience a lot in music now, but that was one of the first records where like you're listening to it and you don't really know when a song is transitioning to the next, but you don't really like wake up from it until it's done. And that's the experience that I had with that album when I first listened to it.
Where were you coming at this record from in terms of like what music were you listening to, or what were you gravitating towards before Grouper came into your life?
I was listening to a lot of jazz. I was going to a performing arts high school and studying with a jazz saxophonist, and those were my first years learning how to improvise in that context. So I was listening to a lot of Ella Fitzgerald, John Coltrane. I was asked to transcribe various saxophonists at that time, and I feel like that had a huge influence on me in other ways. But I was like really living in that world for the first couple years of high school, and that's around the time that I had considered a life in music. And so I wasn't really drawn to other forms of songwriting until around the time that I think I discovered Grouper. And so I think in those few years of high school, towards the end, I was diving more into songwriting and a lot of singers, but also just veering away from jazz a little bit. But it was always, still present.
I love the thought of coming into Grouper, I guess. I mean, been listening to a lot of jazz. This is very broad brush, but to go from something, I guess, quite focused on performative dexterity to total formlessness and strumming open strings is quite lovely. I mean, it's a record that you've picked today and you discovered it back in high school, so I'm curious as to what has allowed it to stay pertinent to you. Like, why have you kept it close to you, and why is it still important now?
I think I find myself to be a very nostalgic person. And this record brings up so much nostalgia for me. And around the time that I was recording the solo album, I was reminded of this record a lot, probably because I was living in that place of nostalgia when I was recording, given like the themes that were coming up when I was improvising. And I hadn't thought of the album in a little while, but around that time, like early last year, when I was recording, I brought up that record and other records of groupers, and I was reminded of like how meaningful it was to me during that time, but how it still holds true today, which isn't the case with a lot of records that were influential to me at that time of my life. You know, there are a few that stand out to me as records that I listen to now and can easily be transported back to that time. But I feel like this record definitely transports me back to that time of my life.
So nice as well, because that's what this record does for me. I think when it came out, it must have been that year or the year after that I discovered it, and I have very vivid memories associated with listening to this record. And there must be something sonically going on, I think, that makes it you know, slither through time back and forth a bit more adeptly than some records, maybe. I don't know, but I mean, Stuck is the track that really sticks out for me in my head when I think back to this one. Are there particular tracks that protrude for you?
Yeah, well, when I was listening through it again, the first two tracks for me really stand out to me. Disengaged, going into heavy water / I'd rather be. Yeah. And what I mentioned earlier about feeling like you don't wake up from the record until it's done. I feel like those two tracks, you know, they just, the first transitions into the second so seamlessly, and then you realize that you're on the second track of the album. And I definitely use that approach in a way, or I wanted to think of those two tracks when I was recording certain things on my solo album. And there's one song in particular that I use my voice on. It's the only song on the album that I'm singing, and I think that those two tracks in the record came up for me when I was recording that song.
Have you seen Grouper live?
I have not. I wish I could say that I have. Have you seen them live?
Yeah, I did, but
cool.
It feels like it feels like a total dream, because I have to. I'm pretty sure I did. It was during the Violet replacement tour where they were doing, you know, this kind of loop-based set, which was really lovely. But I misremember the supports. I remember raving to this particular band saying, I saw you supporting Grouper, and they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it has this, you know, it all feels very appropriate for the kind of terrain of this record. You mentioned other albums as well by Grouper, the ones you connect with. I mean, the whole discography is just fabulous. What are the other ones as well that really connect for you?
Other Grouper albums?
Yeah, that's right.
There's another. Oh yeah, The Man Who Died in His Boat is another one that sticks out for me that I listen to a lot, and that came out 2013. So I was finishing high school around that time, going into college, which again is nice, and it kind of like played into the way that I feel like I had matured in some ways, and I feel like music can remind you of that. And the ways that you've matured, or what still sticks with you, or what you're still working through. And I feel like that album coming out when I was going into college was a nice reminder that like, oh, like I've reached this new place in my life. I'm moving forward, and like this music will always be with me. And I can tap into what I was going through once I listened to this music, but I have reached a different place, which is nice.
Okay, Kalia, let's go to your second important album. Which one do you want to go for next?
I can talk about Promises, the floating points in Pharoah Sanders' album.
Yeah. So, again, give me a little introduction as to why this one's important to you.
So I had listened to Pharoah Sanders before, but never in this context. I've never imagined a record like this.
No.
Either I remember I remember when my partner at the time put it on for me and he was like, I think you would really like this. It's a Pharoah Sanders record. And, like I had an idea of what it could be based on previous records of his. But he put it on and I'm like, what? What is this? Like I'm like, I didn't even know not that one could do this, but
right.
It's certainly one of those records where you're listening and there are different movements, but the motif stays the same throughout the entire record. And the way that Pharoah's playing over it is so sparse but so beautiful. And yeah, I don't know. It's been one of the most important records for me in the last year.
Wow.
Over so many records. I think it's one of the most important in that it's such a great, body of work, but also when listening to it, it's something that I want to do at some point. And it's rare that I'm listening to something like, oh, I would love to, I would love to recreate this in my own way or write something like this. But listening to this record, I feel like this is something I need to do at some point.
Oh, wow. What kind?
Yeah.
What kind of thing do you mean? Like, what is it from this that you want to transpose into your context? That's so cool. I'm thinking mostly. I think the same is true for my solo record, but I'm thinking about like my ensemble records and a lot of the compositions on my last two albums. Like there's one theme that that will repeat over the course of like a 4 or 5 minute track, and there's maybe like subtle variations in the way that the band is approaching the melody or the motif, but it's like it tends to be pretty active aside from like a few compositions of mine. But I generally think of composition, not generally, but like I do think of composition in my quartet setting as like taking one idea and like reinterpreting it and within the course of the piece. So and I feel like Promises is an even more distilled example of that. It's like one idea for an entire album, and Pharoah just gets to like soar over it. And I just like thinking of the way that I improvise in band context as that. Like I try to approach playing with bands, as like just kind of playing melodies that fit within different contexts. And it's hard to like stay true to what I do melodically or improvisationally with other bands, because I do a lot of side person work, so I feel like I'm thrown into contexts a lot where maybe I haven't played with people before, and something that I think about a lot is like staying true to how I sound and like making sure that like my voice comes through in any context. And I feel like Pharoah is one of those people, and just listening to the way that he approaches melody and the way that he approaches impact on this record is something that I strive for. Awesome. Yeah. What's astounding to me is I saw a little video today where, I don't know if you've seen this, Kalia, but they're in the studio, Pharoah and Sam, Floating Points, and it's like this 2-minute clip, and it's before Pharoah's ever heard the piece at all. And he's just saying, so what do you want me to do? And then Sam's like, oh, just like, we'll let the chords loop and just come in when you feels right. So that first movement is the first time Pharoah had like ever heard that motif, and just the first thing I thought to do.
Wait, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I just found that out today. But it's completely recontextualize it, but particularly with you, I guess, given that the record is so important. But the fact that was just on a whim from Pharoah, and it's like now solidified in that first movement is just stunning.
Yeah. See, that makes sense to me because he's so patient.
Right. Yeah.
But I kind of love that that's the first time that he heard it. So
Yeah.
like even if I went into hearing it for the first time, knowing that, I would be like, that's so incredible that like he allows for so much space. Because I feel like I've been in situations before where folks tell me, "Oh, you'll hear it," like just jump in when you feel comfortable. But it's like I'll jump in and it doesn't feel right, or like it doesn't sound good.
Right, yeah.
But he jumps in and it sounds so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean that sounds like pure kind of panic zone for me. Someone being like, "Oh, just go with it." I'd be like, "No, give me 2 weeks with this stuff, and I'll come back with something written down." Have you? I mean, obviously, working within the context that you do, as you say, I can totally see this kind of situation coming up a lot. Is it something that you found that you've had to get more comfortable with over time? Like, what's your relationship been like with those kind of spontaneous scenarios?
Yeah, it's something that I'm more accustomed to now. I still find myself in situations like that, and some are easier to approach than others, depending on the music, depending on the people around me, and also whether the environment feels supportive.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it has a lot to do with that, I would say. Because if it's supportive, then people will help you out and be like, "Oh, this is where it starts. At least this is what's happening harmonically." They'll give you any context as opposed to just like throwing you into something,
right? Yeah,
without any context. But yeah, it's still a part of my career in a lot of ways, and I feel like I'm used to it now. And I think in the situations where it feels uncomfortable or unsupportive, I take that as like a sign that I won't be doing it again in that
right,
in that situation,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there's ways in which it can be a total power play to leave you completely out of the loop until last minute.
Yeah. Right.
With this Floating Points and Pharoah Sanders record, so I had this when it came out, and I was like, this is nice, but then didn't return to it. And then this is the lovely thing about this podcast, is that someone comes along and says it's one of my important albums, and then it completely hits different. And I had just the most incredible experience with this one. How has the record changed in your company in the time that you've been listening to it? And obviously it's ascended to now be a very important record to you. What has that trajectory looked like? Like, how have you been relating to it differently over time, if at all?
I honestly don't know if I've been relating to it differently. It's still very impactful when I listen to it all the way through, and I try to listen to it when I'm able to listen to the record all the way through. So there've been times where I've tried putting it on when I'm on a flight, or I'll put on one movement, but it's not the same for me. So I guess in that sense, like with other records, I'm able to do that, like pick certain songs, or if I'm making a playlist or something, I'll add just one song from a record. And I was making a playlist recently, and I wanted to include this record or something from it. But I told them that, I'm like, check out the record. I'm not going to put it on the playlist because I can't choose a song. I can't choose a movement from it, but you really need to listen to it. And so it's nice because I don't listen to it frequently, but when I do, it's often when I'm in a place where I can like sit down and listen all the way through. So whether that's like if I'm on the subway or if I'm at home and can just like sit down and listen to something, this is one record that I go to.
And they're going to do like a live version of it at the Hollywood Bowl, right? I don't know if you've seen this. Are you going to go to that?
I just saw that because I saw Shabaka's playing.
Yeah,
I believe. Yeah. And I just met Shabaka last year, like early last year.
Oh, cool.
And I'm a fan of his, and so I saw him post about it, I hope I can go.
Yeah.
I would like to if I can.
Kalia, let's go to your final important record. So, what have we got?
Yeah, it's Jeff Parker's Forfolks.
Great. And as before, if you could give me a little introduction as to why this one's important.
Sure. So I was introduced to this record, I think the month before I recorded my solo album. So it was at a time where I was pretty anxious about recording the solo album and having doubts about my approach to solo performance and solo recording because I had never recorded in that context before. And then my friend told me about this record because I've been a fan of Jeff Parker's for a minute, and I believe I believe this is his only solo record. I might be wrong, but
Yeah.
I heard it the month before I recorded, and it just put me at ease because so many of the songs kind of just like live in one space for a while, and that's the way that I think about solo playing. And he plays a couple jazz standards on there, but otherwise some of them are just like folk songs, and I think a few are improvised as well. But it's just him, and he's looping a lot of what he's playing, and it's really, there are no points where it feels busy,
No.
but it's still very captivating, and it allowed me to like think differently about what I do in a solo setting, and just remind myself that like what I'm doing is not that I like had doubts about what I was going to record, but it's a solo album and I play trombone and I'm like, I don't know who's going to listen to this. um, but like I feel really good about the work and what I do, and I don't know, like listening to this record just like reminded me that like, oh, okay, this is why I love solo performance so much,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if was the looping aspect kind of, did that have an imprint on? I know it's never as like point A to point B as this, right, with inspirations and stuff. But I was very interested in the way that Jeff kind of swirls loops into this record, because they're not the kind of things that you would expect to be sort of swept into a loop. They're kind of really choked off and imperfect and kind of scrabbly a lot of the time.
Yeah.
They're really they're the kind of things that you don't often hear, repeated, and yet it's lovely to do so. So I wondered, because the looping on a few of the tracks on your record where it appears is really gorgeously done, and has that, to my mind anyway, that same sense of kind of being these very abstracted scraps that feel really intriguing. So I wondered if this was kind of figuring into your head as you were recording We Fell in Turn.
Not explicitly, because I do have a pretty specific approach to looping, and I do like it to feel like pretty lush and refined in a way when I am creating a loop. But there were a few pieces, and I don't really know. I don't think they ended up on the record. There's one piece I think that ended up on the record where Lee, the producer, was managing the pedals. So like towards the end of one of the days, he had the idea that he would work the pedals as I'm playing.
Wow, right.
Yeah. So one of them actually is Mirrored Solitude, which is the second single on the record, yes. The one in which I'm singing. He was working the pedals on that one. And I still feel like, I mean, it feels scrappy a little bit because I think about some of like the earlier takes of that piece, and they were it's pretty loose the way that the loops ended up feeling. But there were some other tracks that we recorded that didn't make the record that were like pretty swirly, and that's when Lee was working the pedals, and they had like really, really cool elements to them, but in the context of my record, I don't feel like some of them fit.
Right.
But that was like really fun to play around with.
Yeah, that's really cool. You mentioned that you've been a Jeff Parker fan for a while, so how would you come into Jeff's work prior to this record?
So I trying to think my earliest memory of Jeff Parker's. I mean, the first record that had an influence on me was Sweet for Max Brown, and so that came out in 2020. So I feel like I'm a recent fan of his, like since the pandemic. But I've always listened to a lot of guitarists, and I like writing for guitar. And I think a friend told me about Jeff years ago, and I found that record, listened to it a lot, and then I went to the Big Ears Festival last year. I was playing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I was playing there with Moses Sumney, and I saw that Jeff was playing with that band. So I went to go see their set, and yeah, it was such a fun set of music. And I'm also a fan of the saxophonist Josh Johnson, who plays with Jeff a lot, and that was my first time seeing him play. And Micaiah McCraven was playing, so it's just a lot of favorites of mine in that band.
Oh, they were playing the Sweet for Max Brown stuff?
Yeah, they were.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah,
so cool.
Yeah, so that's the only time that I've seen Jeff live. But I was just in LA for a little bit, and he occasionally does Monday nights at ETA, this venue, and they actually just recorded a live album there, and it's this trio with Jeff Parker, Anna Butters, and Josh Johnson. And I tried to catch it while I was in town, but I just missed them. But that's now a band of his that I really want to see that I haven't been able to see yet.
Ooh, nice. Okay, yeah, I'm going to look out for that record as well.
Yeah.
Are there particular tracks on Forfolks that protrude for you as favorites?
Yeah, I really like Suffolk.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of like the longer and like slower moving tracks on the record. And I feel like the pacing of that piece had an influence on the way that I pace some of the songs on my record. While I try to be patient in working through an idea or developing an idea, I noticed, and this is for me a downfall of recording, just in the way that I approach recording, but like I sometimes am fixated on like length or duration. And so I remember when we were listening back to things, I would always ask Lee, like, oh, how long was that? And he's like, you need to stop asking that question because it doesn't matter. Like, just whatever feels right to you, just record in that length of time. Like, I don't want you to like go into recording something thinking it has to be, 3 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't know, like my mind still works that way when I record. And I'm also thinking about these songs or improvisations feeling like a song, like something that was written beforehand, even if it wasn't. Like there are a couple ideas that were premeditated, but a lot of the things that I ended up putting on the record are improvisations. But I want it to feel like a song,
Yeah.
And that's like definitely the way that I approach the solo performance in general. It's like I'm often developing like one melody, and I think on that track Suffolk on Jeff Parker's album, I feel like he does it really nicely, and it's I think that's one of the longer tracks on the album, but that's one of my favorites. So it's just it was like a nice reminder for me, like it doesn't really matter the duration of something, like it's just like how does it feel, and like do you feel like you've made it to the end of an idea?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting you say that about duration, though, because I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that is. I mean, it's certainly a presence that I've felt when performing, and I think for me it's got this kind of social, it's like a social imposition where I'm like,
yeah,
people don't want to hear 8 minutes unbroken of me. Do you have any thoughts on like why like duration is something that comes to the top for you?
I think it's the social element as well. I mean, I see a lot of live music. I have since I was, in high school. I think a lot about live performance from an audience perspective, and I don't want people to be disengaged. Like I want to keep the listener in the whole time. But what I've realized is that, it's always going to be subjective whether someone's into what you're doing or not.
Yeah,
so it's like
sure.
you can't control whether someone's staying engaged or not.
For sure, yeah. Yeah.
But I guess I'm just thinking about it from my perspective when I go to see shows, and maybe shows that are more improvised. Sometimes it can be hard to stay engaged the whole time, and I feel like there are ways that you can hold in the listener, and that might be like making sure that you come to a pause with an idea, even if it's improvised, and like I've been a part of sets where you're playing the whole time. Like we'll play like an hour set with no stops, and I think that's a cool approach. But for me, and because melody is so important to me, it's like I want that to be able to stick in someone's mind or ears when they leave the concert, like what kind of impression do I want to leave on an audience? And it's like I want them to be able to remember something from the material, because that's what sticks with me when I go to see shows, and that's purely what I am drawn to in music. And I know that's not the case for everyone, but that's what I'm drawn to.
With these records, do they tend to be things that these important records, are they things that you come back to regularly? Are they things that kind of drift in and out of your life?
So with the Grouper album, I feel like that was absent in my life for a little while, and it's only resurfaced in the last year or so. But perhaps because Promises and Forfolks just entered my life last year. I mean, I guess both albums are fairly new as well.
Yeah.
But I get Forfolks more so has been present in like my listening sphere. I have some of those songs on like various playlists that I've made, and so I feel like it comes up when I'm, I've been traveling a lot recently, so I'm thinking more so of like music that I listen to when I travel. But I've been listening to Forfolks still recently, and then Promises, like I said earlier, I don't listen to as often, but it's still one that I like. I do crave listening to that album.
Tell me about making playlists, because that's come up a couple of times. Are you making playlists for friends, specific people, like where? Yeah.
Both. I make playlists for myself and for friends, and this has only been a recent thing in the last, I would say, maybe the last like 6 to 8 months.
Nice.
It started when I was on tour last summer into fall. I was doing this big pop tour and spending a lot of time in dressing rooms, just listening to music or like playing music for other people. And, folks would often ask, like, oh, what's that record? Or who's that artist? And it just like, it would always spawn a conversation of like, oh, like, can you send me that? Or like, make sure you send that to me. And so I just started like creating playlists for people on the road. And then I've recently realized that I get immense joy from sharing playlists with friends and receiving playlists from friends.
Yeah.
Too. Like, it's so nice.
Yeah.
And it it brings me so much happiness to like both give and receive a playlist, and you just get like a little glimpse into like someone's personality too when you get a playlist of theirs. And so yeah, and I think my sister asked me for one at the end of last year, so I had a lot of fun making one for her, and now it's something that I regularly update. The ones that I have for myself, I update when I discover new music, or if something's getting old, then I'll take it off.
Wicked. Kalia, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. You picked 3 great records. It's very easy spending a lot of time with these albums, and yours as well, like I say, is really, really wonderful. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, Jack. It was nice talking to you as well.
And to everyone listening, see you next time. Goodbye.